For over 80 years, one of America's oldest secrets lay buried in the Nevada desert. Scientists couldn't agree on who it was. Native tribes fought to reclaim it. And a single strand of DNA would finally reveal the truth that changed everything we thought we knew about the first humans to walk the Americas. This isn't a story about dry academic debates or dusty museum shelves. This is a story about the power of truth, the resilience of indigenous peoples, and the way modern science can illuminate the deepest mysteries of human history. This is the extraordinary story of the Spirit Cave mummy, and how ancient genetics rewrote the entire history of human migration on a continental scale. It's a story that combines archaeology, genetics, law, and the unbreakable connection between past and present. It's a story that nobody expected would turn out the way it did. More importantly, it's a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about how people first inhabited the Americas and how we should treat the remains of our ancestors. Picture the American Southwest in 1940. The Great Basin Desert stretches endlessly, an unforgiving landscape of rock, sand, and sparse vegetation. The silence is profound, broken only by wind and the occasional call of a bird. Deep within this harsh terrain, about 13 miles east of the small town of Fallon, Nevada, lies a place that would become the center of one of the most significant archaeological mysteries of the 20th century. A place called Spirit Cave, nestled in the Stillwater Mountains foothills. On that fateful day in 1940, two archaeologists named Sidney and Georgia Wheeler were conducting a survey. They weren't treasure hunters or fame-seeking academics chasing glory and recognition. They were there on a practical mission, surveying possible archaeological sites to prevent their destruction by guano miners who were actively extracting this valuable natural fertilizer from the region's caves. Guano, the accumulated droppings of countless birds and bats, was valuable for making explosives and fertilizer. Mining operations were threatening to obliterate any archaeological evidence that might be hidden in these rocky chambers. As they explored the dark recesses of Spirit Cave, moving carefully through the rocky alcove, they discovered some things that would puzzle scientists for decades to come. There, wrapped carefully in layers of tool matting, a plant material used extensively by Great Basin peoples, lay the mummified remains of a human being. The body showed remarkable preservation. The individual appeared to be a man in his 40s, dressed in finely woven moccasins and wrapped in a rabbit skin blanket that still retained its structure despite the passage of millennia. Next to him lay remnants of what had once been clothing, baskets, and other artifacts, suggesting a life lived thousands of years in the past. The items found with him indicated someone of some status, someone who had been treated with care and respect at the time of burial. This wasn't a fresh burial, and that was immediately obvious. The extreme drying of the Nevada climate had naturally mummified the body, preserving it in a state that would astound scientists when they finally understood its true age. The arid conditions had removed moisture from the tissue without allowing bacterial decomposition, creating a form of natural mummification that was far more effective than any intentional process. The Wheelers' discovery initially seemed straightforward. They documented their findings, and the remains were eventually transferred to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. At first, it was just another archaeological specimen, one of many that dotted American museums. Nobody realized they had found something truly exceptional. The mummy sat in storage, largely forgotten as decades passed. The significance of the discovery lay dormant, unknown to the world. Then, in the 1990s, something remarkable happened. Scientists applied new dating techniques to the Spirit Cave remains, techniques that had not been available when the mummy was first discovered. Using accelerated mass spectrometer radiocarbon dating, a revolutionary technology that could measure the age of organic materials with unprecedented accuracy, researchers made a stunning discovery that would reshape the entire field of American archaeology. The remains weren't merely 2,000 years old, as initially suspected by the original discoverers. They weren't 5,000 years old. They were approximately 10,600 years old. The mummy had died around 7420 BC, making it not just old, but extraordinarily ancient, placing him in the very early post-glacial period of North American history. It was the oldest naturally mummified human remains ever discovered in North America, surpassing all previous records. It was older than Ötzi, the famous Iceman of the Alps, who had captured world attention when he was discovered frozen in European glaciers in 1991. It was older than most Egyptian mummies, including many of the famous pharaohs whose preserved bodies fill museums around the world. It represented a direct window into the very earliest periods of human habitation on the North American continent, a window into a world that most people didn't even know existed. This revelation sparked immediate controversy. Scientists had questions that demanded answers. How could someone so ancient have been preserved so perfectly? What culture did this individual belong to? Who were his people? What could his remains tell us about the earliest inhabitants of North America? Were these people the direct ancestors of modern Native Americans, or did they represent an entirely different population that had since vanished? These were not merely academic questions. They were questions that would challenge fundamental assumptions about American history and human migration patterns. As scientists began to debate the findings, another voice entered the conversation, a voice that would prove far more powerful than academic theories and disputed skulls. The Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe, a Native American nation based in Nevada, very close to Spirit Cave itself, stepped forward with a claim rooted in both their cultural traditions and their sense of justice. They asserted that they had cultural and genetic affiliation with the ancient remains. They argued that this was their ancestor, a relative who had lived in the same lands where they lived, who hunted the same animals, who drank from the same water sources. More than that, they argued that he belonged to them, not locked away in a museum display case where scientists could study him like an object rather than honoring him as a person. In 1997, they formally requested the repatriation of the remains under a federal law known as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This law, often abbreviated as NAGPRA, was passed in 1990 and gave Native American tribes the legal right to reclaim the remains of their ancestors and any associated burial objects from museums and federal institutions. But the federal government refused. The Bureau of Land Management, which had authority over the case, denied the Falun Paiute Shoshone request without hesitation. Their reasoning was clear but controversial. They claimed that the ancestry of the remains was disputed and uncertain. They suggested that this individual might not be a Native American at all, that he might belong to a completely different population. Instead, they proposed a different theory, one that had significant support among certain scientists. According to some researchers, particularly those who had studied the skull's shape and structure under magnification, this person might belong to a population called the Paleo-Americans. This was a hypothetical group of people who, according to some theories, had arrived in the Americas before the ancestors of modern Native Americans. The theory suggested that these Paleo-Americans had been replaced by later migrations of different peoples who eventually became today's Native Americans, and that no one today could claim kinship to these ancient peoples. If the Spirit Cave individual belonged to this earlier, now extinct population, then he had no modern descendants. No tribe could claim him. No one had the right to remove him from scientific study. He could remain in the museum indefinitely. The Falun Paiute Shoshone refused to accept this dismissal. They knew their own history. They knew their own oral traditions passed down through countless generations. They believed with complete conviction that this was indeed their ancestor. So they took the only action available to them. They sued the federal government, engaging in a legal battle that would test the limits of tribal sovereignty and indigenous rights. This wasn't a quick legal battle that could be resolved in a few years. The case stretched on relentlessly for years and years. 20 years passed with the two sides locked in an increasingly bitter stalemate. The tribe insisted on repatriation, refusing to give up their claim. The government maintained its position that the ancestry was too disputed to allow removal from scientific custody, citing concerns about irreplaceable research opportunities. Anthropologists published papers defending the museum's right to keep the remains for research purposes. They argued that this skeleton provided invaluable insights into North America's earliest inhabitants, and that its removal would be a tragic loss to science and human knowledge. For 2 decades, this legal deadlock persisted. The remains sat in museum storage while lawyers, scientists, and tribal leaders argued about who had the right to decide their fate. But then, in 2015, something shifted. The Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe made a strategic decision. They agreed to allow DNA testing on the mummy, something they had previously refused. This was a calculated risk. DNA testing would require removing samples from the ancient remains. But the tribe believed the truth revealed by genetic analysis would vindicate their claims. They reached out to Professor Eske Willerslev, an evolutionary geneticist from Denmark who specializes in ancient DNA analysis and has made major discoveries in the field. Willerslev worked at the Natural History Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, a prestigious institution dedicated to scientific research, but he also held a position at Cambridge University in England. He was one of the world's leading experts in extracting and analyzing DNA from ancient human remains, someone with an impeccable record of groundbreaking discoveries. But Willerslev insisted on something crucial before he would begin his work, something that set him apart from many scientists of previous generations. He traveled to Nevada to meet with the tribe in person. He sat with them and listened. He listened to their concerns and their hopes and their reasons for wanting their ancestor returned. He explained his methods and his intentions in clear language. He talked about what the research could and could not reveal, and crucially, he made them a promise that he would honor. He assured the Falun Paiute Shoshone that he would not conduct any DNA testing without their explicit permission and agreement. He went further than that. He agreed that if the genetic analysis revealed that Spirit Cave was indeed a Native American ancestor, connected to modern Native American populations, then the remains would be repatriated to the tribe without question. He made this commitment knowing that it might limit future research. Opportunities. knowing that other scientists might criticize him for restricting science, but he believed that respect for indigenous peoples and their rights was more important than maximizing data collection. This wasn't a guarantee of a particular outcome for the tribe. This was a commitment to ethics and respect. It was an acknowledgement that the tribe's claims deserved to be tested through science, and that the results would determine the fate of their ancestor. In October 2015, Willerslev traveled to Nevada with his team, ready to undertake one of the most significant DNA extraction projects in scientific history. Working carefully and respectfully, with the tribe watching and approving each step, they extracted bone and tooth samples from the Spirit Cave remains. The extraction process required great precision and expertise. They worked from the petrous bone, a dense part of the skull structure most likely to preserve DNA over thousands of years, using sterile techniques to minimize contamination from modern sources. These samples contained some of the oldest human DNA ever successfully extracted. Finding viable DNA in remains this ancient is never certain, but Willerslev's team succeeded obtaining precious genetic material from their ancestor. Back in their laboratory in Copenhagen, they began the painstaking process of sequencing the ancient genome. This wasn't simply a matter of identifying who the person's parents were. Genome sequencing meant reading the entire genetic code, analyzing millions of positions across the DNA sequence, and comparing these patterns to known genetic signatures from ancient and modern populations. The team brought in comparative data from dozens of other ancient skeletons from sites spanning 10,000 years of history, stretching from Alaska to Patagonia. They compared the Spirit Cave genome against genetic samples from modern Native American populations and examined the data using rigorous statistical methods to ensure solid conclusions. The results came back from the laboratory, and they were conclusive and unambiguous. The DNA of the Spirit Cave individual showed clear genetic continuity with modern Native American populations. There was no mystery here. He was not a member of a vanished Paleo-American population. He was not part of a separate, now extinct people who had been replaced by later arrivals with completely different ancestry. Instead, his genetic profile aligned unmistakably with modern Native Americans, particularly with the Falan Paiute Shoshone tribe and other Great Basin peoples. The genetic evidence showed that this man, who had died over 10,000 years ago, belonged to the same genetic lineage that had eventually produced the people who still lived in the Great Basin region where he was buried, the same people who spoke languages descended from the language he likely spoke, who hunted the same game, who knew the same plants and water sources. He was truly their ancestor, a direct connection across the vast span of time. The tribe had been right all along. Their oral traditions were correct. Their knowledge was accurate. Their claim to this ancestor was not merely emotional or cultural, but was grounded in the deepest level of biological reality. When Willerslev announced these findings, he made sure to announce them first to the Falan Paiute Shoshone. The tribe confirmed what he had told them. Willerslev stated publicly that the DNA results showed what the tribe had always maintained. They were the direct descendants of the individual buried in Spirit Cave. This wasn't just a scientific finding. This was validation of cultural knowledge that had been preserved through thousands of years of oral tradition. This was acknowledgement that indigenous peoples had indeed maintained continuous habitation and cultural connection to their lands across an incomprehensibly vast span of time. The legal battle ended. The federal government had no choice but to honor its commitment to Nagpara. The remains of the Spirit Cave individual were finally repatriated to the Falan Paiute Shoshone tribe in 2016. But the tribe did not immediately place him in a museum or a memorial. Instead, in 2018, they held something far more meaningful. They conducted a traditional reburial ceremony. They gave their ancestor the respectful burial that had been denied to him for over 70 years. Willerslev attended the ceremony, and he later described it in emotional terms. He spoke of people crying, singing, and praying as the mummy was placed in a casket and offered farewell gifts. He said that attending this ceremony made him understand that this was far more than an academic or legal matter. This was a deeply cultural and deeply emotional event. But beyond the immediate victory for the Falan Paiute Shoshone tribe, the Spirit Cave findings had enormous implications that extended far beyond Nevada. Willerslev and his international team published their results in multiple prestigious scientific journals, including Science, Science Advances, and Cell. These publications represented the culmination of years of research that had examined not just the Spirit Cave remains, but dozens of other ancient skeletons from across North and South America. They had sequenced the genomes of 15 new ancient individuals, and they had analyzed data from 49 additional samples from Central and South America, provided by other research teams. The cumulative findings challenged a century of anthropological assumptions about early American history. For generations, the dominant theory in American archaeology had been that the first humans to arrive in the Americas were eventually replaced by unrelated populations. This theory was built on the observation that some very ancient skulls had shapes that seemed different from the skulls of modern Native Americans. Scientists reasoned that if the skulls looked different, the people must have been different, and therefore likely unrelated. But genetic analysis demolishes this theory. DNA doesn't lie about ancestry. It can't be fooled by skull shapes or misinterpreted by observers with preconceived notions. Willerslev stated this clearly in his public communications. He said that looking at the bumps and shapes of a head does not help you understand the true genetic ancestry of a population. He demonstrated through genetic evidence that you can have people who look very different but are closely related. Physical appearance changes relatively quickly over evolutionary time, but genetic ancestry remains constant. Modern humans of African descent and modern humans of European descent look very different, yet they share recent common ancestors if you go back far enough. Similarly, people from 10,000 years ago might have looked different from modern Native Americans, but that doesn't mean they weren't their ancestors. The Spirit Cave data provided something else that was equally revolutionary. It provided evidence about how quickly humans moved across the American continent after their initial arrival. The Spirit Cave individual was associated with something called Western stem tools, a stone tool tradition that is believed to be older than the famous Clovis technology. The genetic data showed that this person from Nevada shared close genetic relationships with individuals from Lagoa, Santa in Brazil, a site over 5,000 miles away. Yet both sets of remains dated to roughly the same time period, roughly 10,000 years ago. This genetic similarity across such vast distances, despite the incredible distances involved and the short time span in which people must have traveled to create such relationships, suggests something extraordinary about the first humans to inhabit the Americas. They were highly skilled at moving rapidly across unfamiliar landscapes. Think about what this means. These were people who arrived in the Americas with no prior knowledge of the terrain. They had no maps, they had no established routes, they had a whole continent to themselves, and they were traveling great distances at breathtaking speed. Within just a few hundred years of arriving, their descendants had spread from Alaska to Patagonia, adapting to every conceivable environment. They had reached the Pacific coasts and the Atlantic coasts. They had climbed mountains and descended into jungles. They had found their way to islands. This speaks to an extraordinary level of adaptability, skill, and determination. The research also uncovered something completely unexpected. The genetic analysis of ancient South American remains revealed something called Australasian ancestry in some individuals. This means that somewhere in the deep past, there were genetic connections between peoples of the Americas and peoples from Australia and nearby regions. This finding was shocking. It suggested that the story of human migration to the Americas was far more complex than anyone had previously imagined. There might have been multiple waves of migration. There might have been unexpected connections to distant populations. However, the researchers noted that this Australasian signal was absent in Spirit Cave and in most North American populations. This suggests that if there was ancient contact between Australasian peoples and early American peoples, it was concentrated in South America and didn't significantly affect North American populations. Methods described in mainstream Egyptology have actually been tried and shown to work. That testing has, in fact, been done repeatedly by archaeologists willing to spend years quarrying granite by hand with reconstructed ancient tools, specifically to check whether the traditional explanation holds up under real physical conditions rather than just theoretical ones. It does hold up. Teams using dolerite pounders, copper saws with sand slurry, and copper tubular drills with sand have successfully reproduced cuts, drilled holes, and core samples that match the ancient examples in method and appearance. None of this requires lasers. None of it requires sonic technology. None of it requires assistance from a lost civilization or visitors from elsewhere. What it requires is exactly what the Egyptians clearly had in enormous supply. Centralized organization capable of mobilizing and feeding thousands of workers for years at a time, generational transmission of specialized craft knowledge from master stoneworkers to apprentices, and a correct, if empirically rather than theoretically derived, understanding that hardness beats hardness, whether that harder material comes in the form of a dolerite ball or a grain of quartz sand. This is also where it's worth returning to that AI experiment and being precise about what it actually demonstrated. When the tool marks and hardness data from Aswan were run through a language model and the model was asked to reason through how the cutting was done, the response it produced converged on essentially the same explanation archaeologists have documented for decades. Abrasive action using a harder mineral, likely quartz sand, mechanically dragged or rotated against the granite by a softer copper tool acting as the delivery mechanism, combined with percussive pounding using an even harder stone for the rougher initial shaping. In other words, the AI didn't reveal a hidden answer that stunned the scientific community. It arrived through pattern recognition across the same evidence base researchers have already published, at the conclusion those researchers had already reached through physical experimentation. If anything, That convergence is the actual interesting finding here. Not because a machine outsmarted human archaeologists, but because it shows that the conventional explanation isn't a fragile consensus resting on assumption. It's robust enough that an entirely different method of analysis, working from raw measurements and material properties, rather than physically replicating the work, lands on the same physics. Good explanations tend to survive being checked from multiple independent directions, and this one has now been checked by 19th century Egyptologists examining drill cores by eye, by 20th and 21st century experimental archaeologists literally quarrying granite by hand to test the theory, and now by computational pattern analysis working purely from data. All three point the same direction. None of this diminishes how genuinely remarkable the Egyptian achievement was, and it's worth sitting with the scale of it for a moment because they used sand and stone balls can sound almost too simple against results this impressive. Consider the logistics alone. The Aswan quarries sit hundreds of kilometers south of many of the sites where their granite was used, including temples at Karnak and Luxor and structures throughout the Nile Delta. Once a block or an obelisk was freed from the bedrock, it still had to be moved, often to the riverbank, loaded onto barges built specifically to handle loads of hundreds of tons floated down the Nile during the flood season when water levels were highest, and then hauled overland to its final site using sledges, ropes, and almost certainly water or wet mud poured ahead of the sledge runners to reduce friction, a technique that is actually depicted in a well-known Middle Kingdom tomb painting showing a large statue being dragged on a sledge with a worker pouring liquid in front of it. Every stage of that process, from quarrying to transport to final placement, and for obelisks that did get finished, raising the multi-hundred-ton column upright into a vertical position, demanded not just tool knowledge, but planning on a scale that modern engineers still study with genuine respect. The unfinished obelisk is valuable specifically because it lets us see the very first stage of that chain-frozen mid-process before the crack ended the project, giving us a window into work that, on every finished monument, was carefully smoothed away and hidden by the final polish. It's also worth noting what we still don't know with complete certainty, because good history distinguishes between what the evidence firmly establishes and what remains reasonably debated among specialists. We don't have a single ancient Egyptian text that walks through stoneworking methods step by step the way a modern manual would. The how has been reconstructed almost entirely from physical evidence and replicative experiment rather than from written instruction. The exact rotational speed and mechanical setup used for tubular drilling is inferred, not directly observed, since no complete ancient drilling rig has survived intact. And there is legitimate scholarly discussion about how labor was organized on the largest projects, how skilled specialists related to the larger conscripted or corvée labor force, and how techniques may have varied across different dynasties and different quarries, rather than remaining perfectly static for 3,000 years. These are the kinds of open questions actual Egyptologists argue about at conferences. And they're a healthy sign of a field still doing careful work, not evidence that the basic mechanics of granite working are unknown or mysterious. The core physical explanation, pounding with harder stone and abrading with quartz sand carried by softer copper tools, is about as well supported as anything in ancient material culture gets, resting on matching tool marks, matching experimental results, matching material science, and now, for what it's worth, a matching answer from an AI system asked to reason through the same numbers independently. What makes the unfinished obelisk such a fitting place to end this story is that it was, by every practical measure, a failure. The crack that split its base meant the project was abandoned. The labor invested in it never resulted in a finished monument standing proudly in front of a temple, and whoever ordered it built never saw it completed. And yet that failure preserved more real information about ancient Egyptian engineering than almost any successful monument in the country, because success gets polished, hidden, finished, and admired for its final appearance, while failure gets left exactly as it was in the middle of the process. Tool marks and all. There's something worth sitting with in that. The greatest evidence for how an ancient civilization actually worked came not from its triumphs, but from the one time the plan went wrong. And 1,100 tons of granite were left exactly as the last hammer blow had shaped it, waiting 3,500 years for anyone patient enough to read what it was quietly recording the entire time. The Egyptians didn't need lost technology, alien intervention, or secrets. No modern method can explain. They needed hard rock to break harder rock, sand to grind, stone the way it had always ground stone, wood that swells when it gets wet, an extraordinary capacity for organizing human labor at scale, and enough generations of accumulated skill to make brutally repetitive work look, in hindsight, almost impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was just extraordinarily hard, done by extraordinarily capable people. And that turns out to be a far more compelling story than any shortcut a machine could hand us. If this kind of deep dive into how ancient engineering actually worked is something you enjoy, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, and hit the like button if you learned something new today, since it genuinely helps this video reach more people who are curious about the same questions. Drop a comment with what ancient mystery you'd like explained next using real evidence instead of speculation, and I'll see you in the next video.